Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In section 2 of his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, David Hume is going to elaborate a distinction for us that is absolutely central to his philosophy. And he's using terms that we have come to be very familiar with, perhaps a little bit too familiar, because we use them in a very broad sense, and Hume wants to distinguish them from each other. So these are technical terms in Humean philosophy. They're both signifying different ways that the human mind perceives things, including things that it may make itself or its own states. And he calls these, on the one hand, impressions, on the other hand, ideas or thoughts of the human mind. And we have to be very, very careful, because we often talk in terms of having an idea of something in ways that is a little bit different than what Hume would say. And we also talk about having impressions in a way that would correspond to what he here is calling ideas or thoughts. For example, when we meet somebody and somebody says, "What was your first impression of them?" And we have to think about it, and we say, "Well, I suppose that they were a little bit full of themselves," or "they were a very nice person," or "they could have dressed themselves a bit better," or "I had a hard time following what they were saying." We're relying on our memory, and strictly speaking, what we're actually providing the other person is not actually our impressions. We're providing them with something different, which is our ideas, which we're putting into words. So, what is the distinction here? Hume begins, and Hume is a very good composer or writer. He begins with a nice contrast here. He says, "Everyone will readily allow there is a considerable difference between the perceptions of the mind when a person feels the pain of excessive heat or the pleasure of moderate warmth, and when he afterwards recalls it to his memory, this sensation, or anticipates it by his imagination. These faculties may mimic or copy the perceptions of the senses, but they can never entirely reach the force and vivacity of the original sentiment." And he goes on a little bit more, saying that the utmost we say, even when they operate with greatest vigor, say of what? Imagination and memory, is that they represent their object in so lively a manner that we could, keyword, almost say that we feel or see it. But they don't actually arrive at that level of vivacity, the term that he's using, liveliness, right? So impressions are things which we actually experience. They are what is coming in from the outside to the mind, or perhaps it could also be impressions from what it is that we're experiencing internally. So things that we sense through the intermediaries of the five senses, or however many we have, and then things that we feel. And what are the things that we feel? The passions, Hume says. Willing or volition, he's going to talk about that as something that we actually have an impression, not just an idea of, and desire and aversion, so the affective and the sensible or sensuous, we could say, right? That is what we have impressions of. And then ideas are actually copies, he says, or representations of those things. And he says that we can recall them to memory. If we think about all the many things that you can remember, what I was saying just a few minutes ago, right? You were there and you were hearing that at that time. Now, of course, you can back up the soundtrack and hear it again, in which case you can awaken it, right? But you can recall it to memory as well, and it may not be as strong. Or you can imagine it. The imagination is this very interesting, productive capacity that we have as human beings, but there's a fundamental difference between them. What's the difference? For Hume, the difference resides primarily in what we could call the strength of the perception, how it impresses itself upon us. He uses words like forcible, lively, strong for the things that are impressions. So, when we're actually seeing something in front of us happening, or, you could say, I suppose, when we're experiencing it through media. I mean, this is very interesting to think about in the world that we live in, where much of what it is that we see, hear, even sometimes smell is something that's being reproduced, right? We watch something, we listen to music, which obviously we can't have a band there the entire time to do that. Smells are a little bit different in that we have to have some actual thing that we're smelling, that we're taking in through our nose, although you can have fake smells of things as well, right? But those are strong. We're experiencing those at the time. Then the ideas or thoughts are less forcible or lively. He also talks about them as being weak, being faint. In other places, he's going to talk about them as being abstract when we are considering thoughts, particularly those to which we have, as Hume says, united a term. And we assume that there's some sort of impression corresponding to it, right? So we have this distinction here. What we actually experience at first is quite strong, and then the material that we have is weaker. So far, so good. I don't think that too many people would find this difficult or challenging to accept. Another key issue with this is that impressions are not things that we necessarily choose to have. I mean, we can say we put ourselves into situations where we experience them. So, for example, when I go to have my meal later on, I'm taking the fork and putting food into my mouth, and then I'm having a taste and odor sensation, also tactile sensations. A lot of taste is actually mouthfeel, right? So you can say that's up to me in a certain respect. But I don't actually choose to have this interaction between my organ of taste, the tongue, whatever else is going on as well, and the food. It impresses itself upon me. And there's all sorts of things that we taste or smell or hear or see or feel that we don't really want to feel. We would rather have some control over it and not feel those things. So that's a good example of things that impinge upon us or are imposed upon us. With ideas, they can be composed by us. They are, to a certain respect, volitional. Hume goes on and says, "Nothing at first view may seem more unbounded than the thought of man, which not only escapes all human power and authority, but is not even restrained within the limits of nature and reality. To form monsters and join incongruous shapes and appearances costs the imagination no more trouble than to conceive the most natural and familiar objects." And he says we seem to possess this unbounded liberty, but actually it's really confined within very narrow limits. All that this creative power of the mind, the imagination, amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded to us by the senses and experience. And he gives you some examples here. A golden mountain, right? Have any of you ever seen a golden mountain in real life? A mountain really made of gold? No, but can you imagine it? Easily. Just imagine a mountain. Now make it made of gold, right? Or a little bit more difficult, a virtuous horse. We take the figure and shape of horse, and then from our own feeling we conceive virtue. And he says, in all these cases, All the materials of thinking are derived from our outward or inward sentiment. The mixture and composition of these alone belongs to the mind and will, or to express myself in philosophical language, all our ideas or more feeble perceptions are copies of our impressions or more lively ones. Not necessarily copies in an exact sense, but copies of what we take in through the senses or through our sentiments and passions. That furnishes the raw material which then the mind can work upon. If we consider some examples, I think this drives Hume's point home quite well. So we began with talking about a feeling of heat, and he actually distinguished two things, a very hot thing and a pleasant warmth, right? When you're experiencing these, that is quite different than merely having an idea, remembering or imagining or thinking about the sensation of heat. Imagine right now that you are coming in from a cold day, you've just done some chores outside, maybe say chopping wood or cleaning up the yard, and you're shivering a little bit, and you go in and you sit in front of the nice warm fire. And let's even make it more sensuous. Not only is there a sensation of warmth, there's also the smell of the wood smoke and the cheery, glow of the flame and the embers and all of that sort of stuff. You're picturing it, right? It's not the same thing as actually being there, though, and having those sensations. As a matter of fact, we'll talk about more examples in a moment, Hume says that people who do experience ideas of the mind as if they were impressions are disordered. He says, unless the mind be disordered by disease or madness, these ideas can never arise at such a pitch of vivacity as to render these perceptions altogether indistinguishable. And he says, all the colors of poetry can never paint natural objects in such a manner as to make the description be taken for a real landscape. The most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation. And we might say in our own case, well, wait a second, what about movies or virtual reality? People get sucked into that. Hume would say, well, they're responding to it as if they're responding to the impressions that they're getting. They're not really just working with ideas. If they're working with ideas and they think that they're as strong as impressions, then they have some problem. Another great example that Hume brings up that I think shows us a different modality, a fit of anger. I'm sure that all of you know what it's like to lose your temper and to be angry, what the sensation of that is like, or rather the perception, if we want to be a little bit more clear, because it's not felt through the senses as such, but rather a passion that we experience. It's not the same thing as remembering what it's like to be angry, unless we make ourselves angry again, in which case we're having the impression again, right? You think about that SOB and the thing he did to me, and now you get yourself angry. Now you're actually having the impression. But if you only think about it in terms of the idea, it's not as strong, it's not as distinct, it's not as lively. He gives another example, the relish of wine, and says that this is unknown to people living in other places, right? He gives a Laplander, somebody who's living in Finland, quite high up. Presumably there's not wine readily available there, although nowadays, of course, it is, would not have the impression of that and therefore could not actually form the idea of it. He has another great example as well. He says that a selfish heart cannot easily conceive the heights of friendship and generosity, right? Somebody who doesn't actually know what it feels like to be friendly and to be generous is not going to be able to form a very good, that is faithful, idea of it. As a matter of fact, they may not be able to form any idea of it according to Hume. They may have the word, but the word doesn't actually correspond to an idea in their mind, just a kind of jumble of stuff that they may mistake for it. So those are good examples, I think, for driving home what this distinction between impressions and ideas of the mind are. Remember, they're all perceptions. They're all ways in which we're grasping a reality either external to or internal to ourselves, but they differ from each other in these several ways of where they come from, how lively or strong they are, whether we have any degree of volition when it comes to them, and a relationship of being copies or representations. The ideas are copies or representations of the impressions, which we could also, we can compound them to form new ideas, but they're always going to be drawn from the raw material of impressions, according to Hume.